even if computer-aided devices were available to help process spoken contents faster, we could not allow textual volume or density, word choice, terminological distinctions, or phrase length to prevent us from fulfilling the central purpose of interpretation, which is to convey a particular message in a defined context from one person or group to another. Moreover, quality diplomatic interpreting strives to find the nearest natural equivalent, not only semantically, but also stylistically, in the same manner as quality literary translation. The interpreter must shun being so immersed in the source text, adhering so closely to the source language, that the resulting prose is affected and awkward, or even worse, unreadable. Over the centuries, empires have declined, and the imperial power paradigm, characterized by a central dominant power surrounded by smaller powers, a model conducive to monolingualism, has given way in both East and West to a more inclusive paradigm of globalization, conducive to and dependent on multilingualism. For example, had the Roman emperor ever succeeded in establishing central control over all the territories technically under his jurisdiction, the relations of the Western European states to it might have been similar to those of China's neighbors to the Middle Kingdom, with France comparable to Vietnam or Korea, and Great Britain comparable to Japan. That is a quotation from Henry Kissinger's textbook on diplomacy. So we see that there is a parallel between the way diplomacy has evolved in both East and West. Under this form of globalization today, of political dominance and economic hegemony remain present in the world. But a higher degree of harmony is being pursued today that goes hand in hand with fuller support for the right to speak one's own language, even in diplomatic meetings between nations, enabling speakers to achieve greater clarity and eloquence with fuller confidence of success in pursuit of their goals. Looking westward from the ancient Chinese form of diplomatic discourse mentioned earlier, it appears that as the distinctive roles of messengers developed through history, the first professional diplomats were those of Byzantium, with the use of diplomats as licensed spies and employment of information they gathered to devise skillful and subtle policies to compensate for a lack of real power. That is a quote from the History of Diplomacy in the Encyclopedia Britannica. So here we already see in its incipient historical form in Byzantium what is today sometimes referred to as the, quote, warfare versus lawfare situation, an uneven world order in which less powerful nations of necessity rely more on persuasion, skill, subtlety, and eloquence, because they lack the resources or military power to impose their will. And while the strongest power of the day may often prevail on matters of policy, it has long been the case, even before the emergence of today's forms of conference diplomacy, that in contacts among sovereigns, all voices must be heard. I quote from the History of Diplomacy of the Encyclopedia Britannica again. In one 25-year period of the 4th century BCE, for example, there were 8 Greco-Persian congresses where even the smallest states had the right to be heard. Those quotes. In the Ottoman era, the functions of diplomat and interpreter were integrally combined in the position of dragoman, which made interlingual communication an official function entrusted to specialists possessing both language skills and the knowledge of public affairs, British historian Patrick Balfour has vividly described this period. Above all, foreign diplomats had to contend with the problem of language, for none knew Turkish, and few Turks knew a European language. The foreign envoy thus depended upon his own dragoman, his interpreter, who was usually a Greek or a Levantine. I will skip the rest of the quote, which is quite lengthy, but which you will be able to find in the printed version of the presentation. Truth, error, and authenticity. In our era of digital revolution, what impact will digitalization have on the activity of diplomats and interpreters? Machine translation has been gradually improving, but the human brain, the most powerful of all computers, does the job much better and has been doing so for some 74 years, at least since the simultaneous interpreting was introduced at Nuremberg. Because translators and interpreters often work in the midst of controversy, whether in the courtroom or in a conference room, there is a natural inclination to critique their work, largely in terms of accuracy. Critiques which may lend credence to the idea that automating linguist tasks might mean reducing error or eliminating bias, and that mechanized communication is more reliable and truthful because it is devoid of feelings. The opposite is true. Feelings are one of the things that can render an interpretation more genuine, more complete, and more worthy of attention than a flat and dockless output of a computer program. Moreover, an interpreter's skill in using his voice can be more accurate because when he is graphic, he can impart a great thing. As one of their strategies, interpreters learn to memorize and automatically use standardized formulations, collocations, and renditions in order to conserve mental energy. But this is done to save time and focus attention on substance, not to cut corners. The automaticity is self-imposed, acquired through training and experience, that can be departed from at any time. The speed of delivery slackens. The nuance being used by the speaker calls for creative language, different variation, word, original addition to the language. Through use of metaphor, to extend the word, for example. This differs from the automaticity of the computer, which functions like and may have been programmed in one way to translate given lexical terms. Interpreting, like translating, is a kind of writing. Languages, the more the better. When diplomatic agents conveying messages to each other hail from countries that adhere to different customs and speak different languages, it is nevertheless expected that they will have the skill to make the messages they convey not only truthful, but also comprehensible, faithful, and complete. Out of a desire to ensure this integrity of the message, temptation may arise, in the interest of economy or simplicity, to resort instead to monolingual communication. But this may result in inequity and an impoverishment of thought, because it does not take advantage of the cognitive assets of plurilingualism in mixed and multilingual teams. Similarly, the temptation may arise to make use of such contrived solutions as an invented language like Esperanto or a uniform cipher like Morse code. A reductive approach recently reincarnated in the notion that computers, being mathematically infallible, are also more unbiased and efficient, in that they could spare humans the pain of having to learn grammatical rules and vocabulary lists. A fallacy which I described on International Translation Day in 2005 as the cybernetic siren song. With communications technology advances now spanning vast distances and providing means for people to safely interact and work even in the midst of a pandemic, it is tempting to think that comparable technical means could also be used to break language barriers. But there is no beneficent MT genie in the CT magic lantern. Technology is one means by which we externalize thought, but it cannot itself generate or reformulate the message, nor can it be held accountable when the cloud is used for surreptitiously advancing an objectionable idea, while its author is screened from public view through censorship or by cloaking the idea in electronic gadgetry, while the person actually harboring the motive for the act remains sheltered in a cloud of electronic anonymity or plausible deniability, which is yet another recent twist in the game of let the computer do it. Interpreters, being only human, are subject to various kinds of errors, such as lapsus linguae, slip of the tongue, or lapsus calami, error of composition, with different degrees of seriousness, depending on the circumstances and the context. But the errors committed by automated machines are neither errors of form nor errors of substance. They are, in effect, mechanical breakdowns, like a flat tire or a short-circuited lamp. Whether such malfunctions turn out to be harmless, embarrassing, or merely absurd will again depend on circumstances and context. A machine translation error may be as inoffensive as a third-grade schoolchild's misspelling, or it may constitute an affront to personal dignity, such as might justify suing for defamation. A recent salient example is the recent MT-inspired denigration of a head of government by comparing him to a mob boss. I quote, "It was with great pleasure today that I welcomed my friend, Prime Minister of the Underworld, Mark Rutte, in Athens," close quote. Here, the talking machine is going haywire in three ways. First, by uncontextually translating an isolated word, a clumsy mishandling of language structure that professional linguists learn to avoid in their first-year translation class. Second, by failing to recognize the name of a country, an error that any educated person would not commit if he reads the newspaper. And third, by mispresenting a formal title, a mistake that a translator would not make if he has taken the trouble to consult the official glossary. Such an error, if committed by simultaneous interpreters struggling with a fast speech at a conference, would be a stain on their reputation and might lead to a reprimand. If committed by a machine, it merely triggers further cybernetic research and the launch of yet another version of the error-prone software, in the hope of reaching that elusive degree of soulless clockwork perfection at which added complexity and redundancy no longer causes confusion or reveals ignorance. Language, which Chomsky describes as a living, evolving process that makes infinite use of finite means to generate an intelligible universe from an infinite store of thoughts, cannot be replicated by machine. MT embodies the misconception that a machine with no human operator at the controls can perform a task that is normally performed by a person. This fond idea has been around in fiction at least as long as the tale of Aladdin's magic lamp. It is even present in the etymology of some common words, such as the Russian word samovar, which literally means self-heating, and designates a type of teapot popular in Russia that keeps the tea warm almost as reliably as if there were always someone there lighting the burner. But while the idea behind the word samovar may be fanciful or charming, other analogous concepts, such as that of autonomous vehicles, that is, allowing vehicles to drive themselves, are potentially far more dangerous. Automation can increase convenience, but caution is called for, not least because the time may come when humans will need appropriate applications of electronic data processing to secure their survival. And it is therefore critical for us to learn how to draw the line between what machines can and cannot do for us, and use discretion to set rational limits. On the legal authority we delegate to non-human instrumentalities. A parking meter can enforce parking regulations on a public thoroughfare, and an airport public address system can direct recorded instructions to travelers in a public airport lobby. But a computer cannot proffer a policy compromise to a foreign diplomat without risking a violation of the latter's sovereignty or immunity. It is wishful thinking to suppose that advanced machines can economically displace human judgment, that artificial intelligence will act as a convoluted dominator, bringing the most difficult tasks within the reach of the least intelligent users, also incidentally making such machines more widely marketable and profitable. Or that removing human intervention from an activity somehow guarantees objectivity. This problem will not be resolved through refinements in hardware design, software development, because the phenomenon being modeled only grows larger, such as, for example, the quantifiable factors involved in climatic and demographic trends, while at the same time, increasing the capacity of computer programs makes them harder to control. Consequently, depending on the order of magnitude of the trends of the factors being quantified and modeled, there comes a point at which computerized data processing proves unable to supply solutions. Human thought and language, by contrast, is not subject to such limitations. I quote, "Every language, dialect, patois, or lingo is a structurally complete framework into which can be poured any subtlety of emotion or thought that its users are capable of experiencing. Whatever it lacks at any given time or place in the way of vocabulary and syntax can be supplied in very short order by borrowing an imitation from other languages." Close quote. That is a quote from Einar Haugen. Thus, allowing creative language used by humans, especially if it is multilingual, makes it possible to achieve more than what computerized data processing can achieve. It is also less prone to critical error, as illustrated by the case of the NASA spacecraft Mars Orbiter. The Mars Climate Orbiter was a 600-kilogram robotic space probe launched in 1998 to study the Martian climate, Martian atmosphere, and surface changes. The spacecraft encountered Mars on a trajectory that brought it too close to the planet and was either destroyed in the atmosphere or escaped the planet's vicinity and entered an orbit around the sun. An investigation attributed the failure to a measurement mismatch between two software systems. The measurement mismatch in question pertained to the inversion of metric and imperial units, a problem that translators routinely encounter and are trained to identify instantly to resolve correctly. Commonalities in groups. Negotiating difficulty often arises from adversarial positions between two countries or from distances between them in the global geopolitical arena that make it harder to bridge the communication gap. In these situations, the interpreter is serving to some degree as a mediator, since rendering a statement into another language itself inevitably puts the statement in a somewhat different light with the interpreter, which the interpreter should strive to ensure is consistent with the speaker's intent and conducive to resolution. Although bilateral treaties are still serving their purpose, diplomatic relations have become largely multilateral, channeled in multiple languages through contacts in diverse forums, encompassing far-reaching global issues and broad areas of common ground. In conferences dealing with many areas of knowledge, trade, science, industry, or culture, diverse nations often adopt similar public positions, and countries align themselves in categories according to geographical and economic realities, regional affinities, or shared negotiating postures. Countries may form coalitions based on similar interests, shared cultural and linguistic origins, similar circumstances, shared perspectives on common problems, or strategic alliances. Even on vital national security interests and problems as daunting as global climate change or pandemics, consensus positions are often possible, and the compromise solutions often temper sovereignty. The content of public statements made in debate at global conferences cut across cultural, political, geographical, and linguistic lines, and deliberations focused on the existential threat have revealed a vast area of common ground, which by its urgency eclipses many individual differences in national negotiating postures, since failure to address existential threats could imply futility for other issues and efforts. The interpreter's role differs significantly when interpreting in a bilingual setting, be it in a bilateral encounter or legal disputes, or when interpreting into two target languages. In a one-on-one conversation, parties may be sharing the same stage but pursuing divergent aims that shape the public posture they adopt and their expectations of how interpreters should perform. The interpreter is occupationally vulnerable to counter pressures from his two clients. No matter what he does, one party is apt to be displeased. Accordingly, in many bilateral encounters, each party provides its own interpreter, placing each interpreter in a somewhat ambivalent position, reducing all strain at the same time. Identifying with the principle, look who's talking. When making a speech or argument to an international audience, speakers customarily address the chairperson or presiding officer of the conference, invoking general principles that set the scene and strengthen the argument. And the speech generally embodies a point of view that is in some measure regional or global. For the interpreter, giving a convincing rendition of this type of speech means adopting an impartial attitude, while also knowing how to identify with the principal enough to echo his sentiments and make the interpretation performance effective in terms of advocacy. Interpretation may be correct and incorrect, but among a more complex dispersion of alternatives. Close quote from Susan Sontag. That concludes my presentation. I invite you to find the text of the presentation in the proceedings of the conference and to consult and read the footnotes that accompany it, which contain much more information than I was able to speak out in this recording. Thank you very much, and many thanks to the University of Algeria for their assistance and for having the idea of convening this very interesting conference. Goodbye.
إذن أشكر الأستاذ جيمس نولان على المداخلة القيمة التي قدمها. للأسف مثل ما قلت وذكرته في البداية فإن الصوت لم يكن يعني جيدا من التسجيل من المصدر. الآن سأدعو الأستاذ حمودة صالحي ليلتحق بنا إلى اللجنة. هل تسمعني أستاذ حمودة صالحي؟
أصلكم صوتي؟
نعم نسمعك
نعم
جيدا.
جميل.
أهلا أستاذ.
أهلا وسهلا ومرحبا.
شكرا جزيلا. نتمنى أن تكون بخير.
الحمد لله. شكرا على الدعوة. هل أبدأ في المحاضرة مباشرة أم
نعم يمكنك أن تبدأ في المحاضرة. يمكنني أن أقدمك أيضا أم أنك ستقدم نفسك؟
يمكن أن تتولى التقديم وبعد ذلك أبدأ في المحاضرة إن شاء الله.
تمام. إذن الأستاذ الدكتور حمودة صالحي درس الترجمة ولديه ماستر في اللسانيات ودكتوراه في الدراسات الترجمية، وهو مؤسس مشروع الترجمان بروجكت. وهذا المشروع يعني يعنى بتدريب الترجمة وأيضا بالبحث، وهو أيضا مشرف على برنامج الماستر للترجمة والترجمة الشفوية في جامعة تونس المنار. فأستاذ أقدم إليك الكلمة وسوف أنشر مداخلتك بعد ثوان.
شكرا جزيلا. ربما أدعو زميلتي المترجمة صفاء المسعودي وهي ستساعدني في العرض هذا.
تمام.
فإذا كانت
طبعا سأضيفها،
لأنها تعرف متى يكون العرض ومتى. شكرا
نعم
جزيلا.
سأضيفها.
إذن السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته أهل الجزائر الحبيبة وأهل الأرض الآخرين الحاضرين معنا، السيدة الدكتورة عديلة بن عودة، الدكتورة إلهام بالزاوشة، الدكتورة إيمان محمودي، والدكتورة صابرين رميلة، ودكتور فوزي بالعالية. أشكركم جزيلا. شكرا موصولا. وقد أسعدني على الدعوة اللطيفة، وقد فعلا أسعدني قبولها قبولا حسنا، ويشرفني الآن إلقاء هذه المحاضرة تشريفا. أولا أرجو أن الصوت يصل وصولا حسنا، على الرغم من أننا يعني هناك بعض المشكلات الفنية هذا الصباح، وهذا مفهوم لأننا نلتقي بطريقة التحاضر المرئي، وكنا نود أن يكون اللقاء لقاء حضوريا وجاهيا. فأولا أريد أن أتأكد من أن الصوت يصل
الصوت واضح
جيدا.
100%.
جزيلا.
صوت واضح. إليك الكلمة، تفضل.
شكرا جزيلا. So I'm going to switch into English now. Thank you very much, and good morning to you all, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear students, dear friends. again, I wish to thank the Institute of Translation at the University of Algiers too, and the organizing committee for inviting me to this conference and for giving me the opportunity to talk about my experience with interpreting and translation, both as a researcher, but most importantly as a practitioner, as a professional interpreter and professional translator. I also wish to extend my thanks to you, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, for attending this talk, either directly on this platform or through the live stream. And I am aware that there is a live stream. And I wish to invite you all to share your thoughts, knowledge, and expertise in this subject. I invite you to take part in the discussion later on, perhaps, and in the on the chat box, to take part actively by reporting on your own experiences with regard to the arguments and the examples I'm going to put forward and discuss here. I would like also to learn from your own experiences and to learn from your diverse backgrounds, languages, and experiences, because some of the examples or some of the arguments I'm going to investigate might be controversial to some extent. You know, the topic or the subject of this conference and the subject of my talk and the talk of my predecessors, the guest speakers, is really very important. I would like to highlight that importance. The subject of language, translation, culture, diplomacy, and because these are now being studied on the shifting ground of world politics and across an ever-changing landscape of international relations between states, states of peace, coup d'etat, wars, civil wars, pandemics, revolutions, and so on and so forth. So the subject of my talk is about an area at the crossroads of, as I said, language, linguistics, pragmatics, culture, translation, and interpreting. I'm going to talk to you this morning, ladies and gentlemen, or afternoon, depending on where you are, or even evening, about interpreting as cross-cultural diplomacy. And here my definition of diplomacy is not the conventional concept of and conceptualization of diplomacy, because diplomacy's meaning and concept is
Oh, it looks like we lost Dr. Hamouda. هل أنت معنا أستاذ حمودة صالحي؟ أعتقد بأنه فقد التواصل بالإنترنت. الأستاذة صفاء، هل يمكنك أن تفعلي الميكروفون وتلتحقي بنا؟
أستاذ فوزي سامعني؟
نعم أسمعك جيدا.
النور. صباح النور. يبدو أن السيد حمودة فقد الاتصال. أنا أقترح أن
نعم
ننتظره بعض دقائق فقط حتى يلتحق ثم نواصل العرض.
لا مشكلة، سنحاول الانتظار قليلا.
طيب شكرا.
شكرا لك. لا بأس، قد نفتح ربما نقاشا ونطرح أسئلة ربما على المداخلات الماضية. هل لديك أسئلة لنطرحها إلى سيسيليا ربما وهي متواجدة معنا؟
نعم زميلي فوزي، هناك أسئلة للأستاذة سيسيليا. هل أنت في الاستماع فوزي؟
نعم أسمعك. سيسيليا
نعم
are you
شكرا.
here with us?
إذن هناك
Yes, I'm here. I'm sorry, it's just that the interpretation is coming on and off, so I'm a bit lost with what's happening. So, but if you talk to me in English or Spanish, I'll be
Okay,
happy
I will.
to answer questions. I have a few
Yes.
questions that I noticed from the chat, which I'm happy to answer
Great.
whenever you
So
say.
about the questions you have noted, you can start answering them, and then we will see with other comments or additions.
Of course. So I spotted two questions. One related to the pandemic and how we continue to work during the pandemic, and the other one related to who will be teaching and training students as diplomatic interpreters. So let's do the second question first, if that's okay with you.
Yes.
In an ideal world or in an ideal situation, I think that this should be addressed with a combination of experts in each of the fields. So it could be, this is purely my imagination and what I envision I would like to see happening. So I would like to see a specialist master's program as a specialization for diplomatic interpreting. So we would have interpreters trainers that on top of teaching simultaneous interpretation skills, they would teach note-taking, which should be added to the curricula, which is not. My training back in Argentina was a little bit traditional. So we started with side translation, note-taking, and then simultaneous. So that could be a good approach. And then we would need perhaps guest lecturers if you want to have an overview of all the different supplementary skills. Could be even teachers of those skills. So there are many people who are teaching protocol, or they are teaching cross-cultural communication or intercultural studies. And I think that the interpreters, at least you should have a panel of or a advisory group of practicing diplomatic interpreters who could guide those experts and say, this is what interpreters need. The clearest example would be protocol. So we don't need to learn how to set the table. We need other aspects of protocol because those are the ones that we use when we are interpreting. So we could sort of walk them through this and then put together a program. Then pandemic. So for the pandemic was quite a challenge. And traditionally, especially for me here in the UK, mid-February till the end of March is usually my busiest time with delegations. And at the beginning of the pandemic, I had 6 weeks of back-to-back delegations canceled over 48 hours. So you can imagine how terrifying that was. However, we could slowly transition into online. So over the last 18 months, many of my clients transitioned into running online forums, online webinars. We had a few hybrid experiences, especially during the spring, so in the last 3 months or so, not 4 months, 3 months. And it was I needed to understand very well how the online environment works, especially for multilingual settings. And fortunately, I had experience. I had been volunteering for remote interpreting for the last 3 or 4 years with different organizations, because I knew it was an added value. At the time, I saw it as an added value to continue working with visiting delegations once they left the UK, because I was already involved in the project. But then it came in very handy because I could advise them and give them ideas of how they could create virtual experiences. So you had to be very proactive. But we need to, and that's another difference with conference interpreter, because it's so hands-on and you need to be able to decide what's the best way to assist your client. You need to understand the technology. Those are tools, microphones, computers, tour guides, those are tools. So at least you need to know how they work, so you can advise which one to use, and then have the technical stuff to support you. I see there are more questions coming in.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So let me see if I can scroll back, or you can help me as well if you wish.
Yes. So quickly, there is this teacher with us, Dr. Hamisi, who is an interpreter. He's asking about the specialty when we dedicate a diplomatic interpreting inside our universities and translation institutes. Who will train the interpreters? Who is the person who will try to train them? So should they be interpreters of diplomatic background or general interpreters, or what do you think?
It depends on what you are training. I don't know exactly how the setup for your university is, but you would have an interpreting tutor. That could be a general interpreter, because you are teaching interpreting skills. The problem with interpreting skills these days is that, at least in Europe, all the masters, the European Masters of Conference Interpreting, usually have little to no note-taking consecutive training. They're changing it. So if you have interpreter trainers who can teach consecutive, those could be general, because you're teaching interpreting skills. So you need to, I think that what happened was, and this also discloses my age, I'm older, so I came from an old school of teaching, and it was simplified, and now it's only focused on simultaneous, whereas in the past we used to learn note-taking, and now it's not the case. So maybe we need to bring it back in a sense, and the same as retour depends on each country. Spain traditionally is only unidirectional training, so it's only a single language booth, and now they are ramping up retour training, because diplomatic is constantly bidirectional. You don't have an English booth or somebody working with you. So now they are bringing back, or they are actually in Spain for the first time, bringing retour training, which you also need. So for interpreting skills, I would say general interpreters could do the training. And then for specific skills, there should be somebody who's versed in those skills. And I think that there should be practicing diplomatic interpreters who are, fortunately, either they're interpreting or they're teaching, but they could be really good supporters or advisors when putting together the curricula.
Thank you so much for your answer. There is another question about, well, this one is more about the work field, and when you were a diplomatic interpreter, were there situations where you weren't able to understand a certain term or a phrase by a diplomat?
Yes.
Or let's say in a situation of a high diplomacy level. So what is the behavior of an interpreter?
So yes, there's always something that you don't understand. And I'm sure that all translation teachers are going to start noting now when I say context is everything. And so context helps a lot. I think that the best thing that would help you is remain calm, be well rested. One of the best pieces of advice I got was before my first translation test back in translation school, when our teacher told us, don't study the night before, go to bed early. And if you can, like, go to the movies or to the hairdresser or whatever relaxes you, because what you need is your wits. So we know a lot more than we think we do. So if you don't understand something, you can get context to help you. And depending on the situation, maybe you can ask, or you can ask for repetition. Sometimes it's not possible. If you don't want to ask for repetition because you didn't understand the term, I never say I don't understand the term. I'd rather say I couldn't hear. Face saving the interpreter as well. And the same is when somebody is speaking very, very fast. If you ask somebody to slow down, the person, if it's a nice person, is going to slow down, but they will forget. 30 seconds later, they will forget and they will go back to the natural pace. However, if you tell them you can't hear them, they will speak louder. And when they go loud, they speak slowly. That's a natural reflex. And it's out of their own interest to be heard. So it's their interest to be heard, not their interest to help me. So you need to be resourceful. But then it's experience. And that really, really counts. So if you are just starting, whenever it's possible, start with a senior interpreter next to you. You may not be invited to the super high level things, but you won't be able to handle them anyway. So start the lowest ranks, the lowest levels, and get a senior interpreter next to you. I think that's a lot better than just volunteering on your own or not having somebody to give you feedback and to be able to see you at work, or you can see them at work and learn.
Well, great. Thank you so much for
You're welcome.
the answer. I think it answers also the next question about stress and pressure and how to handle it. Maybe also a good night's sleep helps a lot.
Yeah, you can't always get it.
Yeah.
You can't always get it. Sometimes you're just flying and you just land and you jump in. But that's what I meant when you have to know yourself. And sometimes, yes, I mean, I think interpreters, we can manage stress. And I know that some authors and some experts have compared the pressure of our work to air traffic controllers. But you need to know when you need a moment to slow down. Maybe you go to, excuse yourself, you go to outside the room, or you go to the toilet sometimes, and you just catch your breath and then you come back. But yes, that is part of the package. It's part of the excitement as well.
Well, one last question. Is there an organizing body for the diplomatic interpreters in the UK, like a national register?
No.
What type of?
There's no professional body of any sort in any part of the world, as far as I know. And the way that diplomatic interpreters work, I mean, this is the commercial point of view. So how do you get into diplomatic interpreting? I'm sure that's not the question that people are asking. You're very nice. Because usually I get, where do I get clients? That's the first question. Well, It depends on each country. So each country has their own regulations. There are countries who only have a staff interpreter at presidential level, and everything else is contracted with freelancers or the trusted team of freelancers. There are countries where they have entire teams that are employees of, let's say, the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, and they do translation and they do interpreting. There are countries where there's nothing, and it's just a free private market for everyone. So it depends on where you are and what your languages are. And also it depends on what you want to do. I mean, I moved from Buenos Aires to London to do this. There's not much diplomacy going on in Buenos Aires, at least not as much as in London. So you need to find out wherever you are, how it works and how you access it.
Well, thank you so much.
You're
thank
welcome.
you
My
very
pleasure.
much. And Sir Hamouda Saleh is here with us now. We lost you for a few moments, but Cecilia saved us.
I'm glad I could hear you because I was trying to get...
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
It is really, I'm really very sorry this happens.
It is okay.
And these are the disadvantages of working online. There are so many other advantages, but still we are at the mercy of the internet and the technology. Exactly. So I'm wondering, what was the last idea you've heard from me?
I will show
turn
you
my
the
camera off and my
slides.
microphone, so I'll let you know.
Thank you, Cecilia.
Thank you very
so
much.
much.
Thank you,
welcome.
Cecilia.
For the answers. So I will show you the So
exactly.
here
So
is
the structure of my talk.
Yeah, you have the floor back.
Thank you very much. So it is. So this is the structure of my talk, speaking about the way how interpreters are acting as diplomats, interpreters as cultural clarifiers, interpreters as messengers of peace, interpreters as negotiators in business deals. But sometimes interpreters are being called to testify, compelled to testify. And here there is a very famous case. I'm going to report on it later on. And the second chapter would be about the visibility and invisibility and powerfulness and powerlessness of interpreters, and about the judicious intervention that interpreters sometimes are allowed to intervene in the meaning and add a spin of their own culture. So this is above language level, but the stakes are also taking place at language level, because language is tricky, and the interpreter is required to have and acquire a skill of adaptation, and more particularly a magic to bring about a magic remedy. And I will finish this presentation by a message, interpreting in conclusion. But before that, I would like to invite you, ladies and gentlemen, to try your hands at these expressions and utterances, which have been extracted from real conferences, real life conferences and texts. First, I'll think about it. Second, Your Excellency or Your Excellencies. Third, with a push and a shove. 4, great power competition. 5, the Mujahideen of the Islamic State. 6, the world's most powerful men. And 7, النكبة عافانا وعافاكم الله. 8, الشيخ. 9, imprisoning women for defying the wishes of men. 10, what refugees face on their treacherous journey. 11, إرضاء للميليشيات وخدمة لأهداف إردوغان. 12, refugees risked everything to make this treacherous journey. 13, Supreme Court has struck down the death sentence for blasphemy. 14. Comfort women. 15. Maximum security prison. 16. التحقق من صحة الادعاءات. 17. Strange political mouthings, lies, and fabrications. 18. Had the blood of the Palestinians killed in Sheikh Jarrah. And 19. Erez crossing. 20. Resolution. So, interpreters as diplomats. Modern diplomacy is currently experiencing fundamental changes on an unprecedented rate. Diplomacy does not pertain to diplomats only. It also pertains to judicial, security, military, religious leaders, and other community leaders and officials as well. Interpreting in diplomatic settings is often complex in that it involves a wide range of linguistic, pragmatic, discursive, cultural, psychological, and other protocol elements and factors that make communication possible. And here I'm really very happy to speak about Cecilia and James, because they laid the foundation for me to speak about other things, because they have covered most of the elements and factors required and the conditions working in diplomatic settings. So the interpreters, who are invisible most of the time in a dimly lit booth, in most cases, they actively participate in turbulent peace talks, transitional justice reforms, and public hearings of victims of violations of human rights, for example, and actively participate in war crime trials like the Nuremberg trials, or in somewhat calmer trade negotiations, and in all other kinds of international meetings. Their presence is crucial at important gatherings of diplomats who are attempting to settle international disputes or to mediate some problems and difficulties, especially in contexts now in the Arab world that is facing enormous challenges: mediation in Libya, mediation in Sudan, mediation in Yemen, in Syria, and so on, and even in Tunisia. So in their own way, through a language skill, through an intercultural competence, interpreters contribute to world harmony. Interpreters in diplomacy can prove very rewarding, as interpreters feel that they are giving their small, sometimes tiny, contribution to history in the making. But sometimes you do not act, or you are called not to act only as an interpreter, as a human being, as a part of an exchange or a communication. You are a human being. And interpreters, despite the fact that this is controversial and most of the codes of ethics, they perhaps warn some interpreters not to go the extra mile and act as a cultural advisor and stick to what has been said. But sometimes to stick to what has been said might not serve the communication ends. And here is one example. There is a story that is in the literature about President Nixon of the United States of America, who received and welcomed Emperor Hirohito. And during personal negotiations, President Nixon asked Emperor Hirohito one question, and the emperor at one point responded to this question by saying, "I will think about it. I will think about it." And the interpreter translated it literally. I would think about it. But the interpreter in this case should have made it very clear to Mr. Nixon that this answer translated as no, knowing the Japanese culture. Since this was not done, the result was a misunderstanding, as was not serving communication, as I said, and produced some resentment later on. Japanese people, like Oriental people in general, and including Arab people, they really find it very offensive to say no. Arab people might say, Inshallah. Inshallah, and here we keep on, in Tunisia, in the Tunisian context, we keep on joking about the word Inshallah because it has at least 20 meanings depending on the intonation. When you say, Inshallah means no, or Inshallah, yes, I confirm, and so on and so forth. And here, I have a testimony. I have conducted a research a while ago and interviewed some officials. And I would like also to come closer to the speakers and the officials to have fresh insights into their perspective of communication. This is really very helpful for the interpreter, whether the interpreter has to measure it before getting into that or acquiring that freedom or that power. It has to be granted that power first. So interpreters can act as cultural clarifiers. Interpreting has long been regarded as cultural assimilation. And here I would like to invite my colleague and friend, Dr. Bilaiba, to display the first audio testimony, the role of the interpreter as a cultural advisor, the example of the bread. The example of the bread here, if you do not intervene as an interpreter,
quite recently to me. We were involved in an exercise in a
Please go ahead, yes.
In an exercise in a police camp, and we were trying to encourage the students to chase us as we were playing the role of being riders. I saw what I assumed was a stale piece of bread sitting on a wall. I picked it up and I threw it at the shields of the police officers to try and encourage them to chase me, and the whole event just stopped. And I could hear a lot of the language coming that I knew I'd done something wrong, and I realised then through the interpreter that, you know, this was a cultural issue in Tunisia, and any pieces of bread are left for small animals to try and encourage them, and it's a blessing if you do help feed these animals. So through the interpreter again, I apologise to the guys. I was unaware of this, and these things can happen, and without the interpreter there to smooth the waters for me again, well then it'd be hard for me to interact with the students.
يبدو أننا فقدنا الأستاذ صالحي مرة أخرى. أظن أن لديه مشاكل في الاتصال بالإنترنت. هل تؤكدين لنا أستاذة صفاء؟
نعم صحيح، يعني لا أظن أننا فقدنا الأستاذ شخصيا، لا يمكن سماعه. أظن هناك مشاكل في الإنترنت ربما.
سيد فوزي، هل تسمعني؟
نعم.
أنه فقد الاتصال مرة أخرى وهو يحاول الالتحاق بنا مجددا الآن.
تمام
شكراً.
ننتظره قليلا.
لقد عاد سيد حمودة مجددا.
أهلا وسهلا من جديد. Sorry again.
أهلا بك أستاذ.
أهلا وسهلا. هل الصوت يصلكم؟
نعم. نعم أستاذ.
أعتذر من جديد.
نعم لا
شكرا.
مشكلة لا مشكلة، هذا
شكرا.
يحدث كثيرا بشكل
نعم.
عادي، فتفضل.
شكرا. So this is the role of the interpreter as a cultural clarifier, as a cultural advisor. So I would like to invite you also to play the other audio testimony, the example of Mohammed, please.
Okay, I will.
Thank you.
One second.
Tunisia about culture and cultural differences, and if you may just show the role that an interpreter, for example, has played here in Tunisia.
I know certainly when we first come to the country, I was responsible for training the trainers with regards to adult education, and one of the things I was trying to convey to them was how to use a case study. Now, one of the examples I gave, because I wanted to keep it local, was that I used the expression, Mohammed steals a car. And I said to the interpreter, this is the expression I'm going to use about case studies. And he stopped me and said, no, change the name from Mohammed, because there are people in the classroom who might find it very offensive that you're using the name Mohammed. Now, for me, it's a common name. I would not have seen the fact that that could potentially cause offence. So had I not been corrected at that very early stage, it could have meant that we could have got off on the wrong foot with our students.
Thank you very much. So here again is another example of this judicial intervention by the interpreter. Can you hear me well now? Hello?
Yes, we do. Yes, we
thank
do.
you. So interpreters also can act as messengers of peace in this age of, but I think you cannot see me, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yes, I don't know how to turn on my camera. So, yes, in the age of poaching liquidity, enforced migration, and overwhelming globality, in the age of bitter armed conflicts and worldwide pandemics, forms of struggle and movements of resistance, mediation negotiations, and hence expressions have started to slough off their very local nature and started to be transferred and mediators started to transfer these excessively culture-bound skin across the bridge of translation and interpreting by old mediators, namely diplomatic translators and interpreters. Through language, intercultural competence again, and other skills certainly, translators and interpreters have acted over history as messengers of peace, exactly like diplomats, facilitating negotiations and inclusion through the transfer of those local needs and cultural experiences and expressions over the bridge of understanding, acculturation, and cooperation. Last summer, I gave a talk on interpreters and judges in judicial cooperation, the search for common ground, and invite you to watch it later on. So interpreters are also crucial in commercial negotiations. And here I would like to invite Dr. Fawzi or Safa to share the last video. Thank you very much.
Yes.
you can have the best project in the world, but if you don't have the best interpreter in the world, you won't be able to sell your product.
The other evidence that interpreters can act as diplomats is the perception of interpreters by others, by the participants in a communication. And here the evidence is that sometimes they are called to testify. You all know and aware of the very famous case of the US Congress Democrats. Democrats are the US Congress who compelled the Russian interpreter to testify. That took place in 2018. There was an attempt by the Democrats in the US Congress to subpoena the State Department's Russian interpreter who worked in close door meetings between President Trump and President Putin. They hoped to obtain some undisclosed content of what was discussed through her testimony and notes. So although this never materialized, but still this raised a very good question about the role of interpreters and the discussion of the codes of ethics. Again here, the AIC stood firm against the interpreters being brought or compelled to testify. Now I move on to the question of invisibility and the power or visibility and the power that can be granted to interpreters. Top-ranking interpreters are well aware of their own worth. Oftentimes, they venture liberties. They grant themselves liberties that lesser experienced interpreters would not dare. Here there is a story of an English language interpreter who was interpreting for Adolf Hitler and other world leaders. So whenever anyone at the conference became excited and talked too fast, this interpreter did not hesitate to intervene and restore order in a way by reminding the participants and the world leaders that he could not process a certain limit of words. So by the way, that room where the proceedings took place was called by one of the participants the schoolmaster, the schoolroom, because the interpreter, who was at that time Dr. Paul Schmidt, was described as a schoolmaster, bringing his people to order and curb unruly peoples. So high-level and experienced interpreters exert a certain power in the practicing of their profession. And here, judicial intervention is required in the profession, such as the example of I will think about it. Although their skill are linguistic and intercultural to a large extent, and that their main role is to facilitate communication, interpreters are far more than simple carriers of meaning and relayers of speech. This power stems from the considerable credibility enjoyed by the competent, reputable, neutral, and impartial interpreters. But again, I'm going to discuss this at language level. Here, language is really tricky. And this requires the skill of adaptation and the magic remedy to be brought by the interpreter. May I ask Safa to please stop sharing the screen, because I would like to be in interaction with the participants. Despite the fact that language is tricky, it offers magic remedies. for its users, and interpreters are some of the users. Take the following examples. When I say on va être en retard, how to translate that to an English speaker in a diplomatic setting? With some judicious intervention, I can translate it as we are going to be a little late. So I add little, a little late. Or a Tunisian official stating, sometimes directly, ماهيش باش تمشي هكا، ماهيش باش تخدم هكا. I might translate it also in this particular context. That might not work this way. That might, and I add the might. So here, these are required also to smooth the waters and not to be very, sometimes offensive. Languages are also based on a universal human experience that is offering many common denominators between their respective cultures. Interpreters and translators can still look for and rely on those commonalities. Let's take just one example, like remedy, for example. I found out that many proverbs coming from different languages and cultures and different experiences, they share the same message, sharing the same message. And here there is a slide about remedy. Here, I would like, can you please share the slide, Safa, please? Yes. Here, some remedies are worse than the disease, a Roman proverb. For extreme ills, extreme remedies, Italian proverb. Cauterization is the last remedy. An Arabic proverb, as you know, آخر الطب الكي. وهو يضرب به، هذا المثل يضرب في آخر ما يعالج به بعد اليأس. 4. If there is no remedy, why worry? A Spanish proverb. 5. Adapt the remedy to the disease, Chinese proverb. And 4. Great evils, strong remedies, a Dutch proverb. Thank you. The language, the intervention of the interpreter and translator is language-based and culture-driven. And it is in a way conducting some sort of diplomacy and mediation. I'm going to investigate this topic by the discussion of the translation and interpreting of utterances extracted, as I said, from real life conferences and texts. Let me start by the translation of honorary titles. Honorary titles are really complex, and Arabic is rich in modes of address. Honorary titles differ greatly across the social, religious, the political hierarchies. Take the example of Your Excellency. How would you translate it? If you have an ambassador, you would say Sa'adat al-Safir. If there are excellencies, for example, I may rush in simultaneous interpreting أصحاب الفخامة والمعالي والسعادة وهكذا. A title used to refer to high-ranking officials. Now, diplomats are, we address diplomats with Her Excellency or His Excellency, presidents of republics, most ambassadors, high commissioners, permanent representatives, and so on. In the judiciary, we tend to use honorable judge, or sometimes Your Excellency, or Your Honor in Australia. It is really fascinating to know that, for example, in Jordan, judges are addressed عطوفتك, عطوفة القاضي. So here we adapt the form of address to the context. The monarchies, Your Majesty, Royal Highness, in case of Al-Amir, in Arabic is جلالة الملك, سمو الأمير, أمير المؤمنين في السابق, and even now in Morocco. So religious, His Holiness, the Pope, قداسة البابا وهكذا. And the Grand Ayatollah, Ayatollah al-Khomeini. Now I'm going to discuss some examples from real conferences and texts with a putsch and a shove. So here describing what happened in Sudan recently, whether it is a coup d'etat or not. A putsch, it's not a coup d'etat. And the armies taking over. The armies taking over. In Sudan, jihadism and great power competition are behind the rising coups. Here I would like to investigate the word competition. And here there is some sort of culture here that we need to discuss. A putsch is now that is different from a coup in the sense that a coup is quicker and highly successful act. But a coup might be an attempted, a putsch, sorry, is an attempted coup. And that's why it is sometimes, and it is not finished coup as you have witnessed and followed the news. That's why the interpreter or the translator did not translate it as الانقلاب، لأن الانقلاب هو ناجز هنا، ناجز هنا، ولم ينجز هذا الانقلاب في نهايته. But what is meant here is the monopoly of power by the army in Sudan and in other African states. So here in the sense of the rebel, تمرد الجيش على السلطة المدنية، تمرد السلطة العسكرية على السلطة المدنية، وأتينا بها سجعا التمرد والتفرد. والتفرد شاف to push وتتفرد بالسلطة. Because this might be the title. The army's takeover in Sudan highlights a worrying trend. تسلط الجيش على السودان يرسخ نزعة مفزعة. Jihadism and great power competition. Competition تنافس القوى العظمى. I would say تنافس in Arabic would not mean that because التنافس هو أساسا في الخير. This is culturally speaking. التراغب في الخير. So it is for the good. It is a competition for the good in Arabic, unlike English. That's why we opted for تداحر القوى العظمى، وهو تداحر غير معلن أحيانا، والتنافس فيه تداحر على الدول الأفريقية من الصين والولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، China, Russia, United States, and the European Union, and so on. So here, this is the first, another example. The other example, in May, the last border outpost between Syria and Iraq, still controlled by the regime, and President Bashar al-Assad fell to the Mujahideen of the Islamic State. Mujahideen in English, so the original text is in English here. One of the interpreters translated it as Mujahidi الدولة الإسلامية. Here مجاهدون الفلسطينيون, this is also positive. So I think we can introduce some judicious intervention and translate it by jihadiyin أكثر, more pejorative. Let's move on. The world's most powerful men. World, العالم in Arabic, but here we can interpret it as الأرض. أقوى رجل على وجه الأرض، لا نقول وجه العالم أو في العالم، وجه الأرض أفضل. النكبة. النكبة might be translated as calamity, disaster, catastrophe, but also can be translated as a nakba if it refers to an incident in history with the Palestinians. So we keep it because it marks some incident in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Here, الشيخ, depending on the context, and the diplomatic context in particular, might be religious title, Sheikh al-Azhar, the Sheikh, and it remains here Sheikh al-Azhar, or Sheikh al-Islam, for example, Ibn Taymiyyah, وهذا اللقب يطلق أساسا على الفقهاء فقهاء ورجال العلم. So here we translate it as a scholar of Islam. Scholar of Islam. When I say Sumu Sheikh, like in Kuwait, for example, so His Highness, or His Majesty, sometimes His Highness Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmed Subah, for example. Now, let's move on now. Or sometimes the plural, Sheikh of Mashayikh, and when it is plural of Mashayikh, this is the religious. So these are the scholars and the imams. We can translate them as imams of Zaytuna, Mashayikh Zaytuna. And here, depending on the context and the whether it is religious, political, and general, we can translate. Another text or conference, Jordan urged to stop imprisoning women for defying the wishes of men. And here I would like to focus on defying the wishes of men. منظمة العفو الدولية تحث الأردن على التوقف عن حبس النساء, and here we opted for عصينا الرجال أو عصينا بعولتهن. البعولة, so men can be translated as بعولتهن. This is culturally, we can make the adaptation to the Arabic culture. And here, by the way, this is a back translation when you state it in English. Again, دعت منظمة العفو الدولية الأردنية إلى إلغاء العمل بنظام الوصاية الذكورية التي تراه deemed inappropriate، تراه نظاما مهينا أو جائرا إذا ما أقدمت المرأة على عصيان أمر الرجل أو بعلها. عصيان أمر هنا إذا ما بنت علاقة رآها الرجل غير لائقة، inappropriate. It is really very problematic to translate inappropriate language, indecent, etc. Because it is loaded with cultural weight. And I'm not going to discuss here al-wisaya, al-wali, wal-qayyim, wal-wakil, and so on. This is, especially in legal culture, this is really rich discussion. And I have made that discussion with my students. Now, another example. What refugees face on their treacherous. Can you hear me quite well now? Just a check.
Yes, we do. We hear you very well.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So here, what refugees face on their treacherous journey. Here the interpreter can have recourse to a technique called explicitation, to make something implicit explicit, which it's implicitly expressed in English. What refugees face means الأهوال، أهوال الرحلة. نترجمها أي أهوال تنتظر اللاجئين في رحلتهم المحفوفة بالمخاطر مثلا، وهكذا. Another example. حكومة السراج تزج بنفسها في صراع دولي إرضاء للميليشيات وخدمة لأهداف أردوغان. The Sarraj government is now sinking or plunging itself ever deeper into an international conflict to the satisfaction من السهل الممتنع هذا of militia groups and in the service of Erdogan's أهداف هنا agenda، بمعنى الأجندة interpreted as agenda. Another example. Refugees risked everything to make this treacherous journey. خاطر اللاجئون بحياتهم وبكل ما يملكون ورموا بأنفسهم في أتون هذه الرحلة. أتون نأتي بها لأنها تعبر هنا عن هذا المعنى وكأنها نار سيحرقون فيها في هذه الرحلة المحفوفة بالمخاطر. Another example. Pakistan's Supreme Court has struck down the death sentence for blasphemy. And here the word is blasphemy on folks here. Handed over. هي سب الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم في قضية تجذيف ترجمت. The Israeli government had the blood of the Palestinians killed in Sheikh Jarrah. يعني ونقول الحكومة الإسرائيلية ملطخة بدماء الفلسطينيين أو أيديها ملطخة بدماء الفلسطينيين الذين يمكن أن نقول استشهدوا في حي الشيخ جراح. Another example, attempting to cover its past crimes, such as the use of comfort women by the army. Comfort women here is very problematic to translate. It is really cultural. Comfort women ترجمت على أنها نساء المتعة. But I think we need to revisit the translation to, in a sense, reflect that cultural uniqueness of the term comfort women. Break into a maximum security prison. Security ليس فقط الأمن. هنا security can be interpreted as الحراسة. اقتحام سجن شديد الحراسة. التحقق من صحة الادعاءات. هنا التحقق بمعنى to ascertain, and this is technical term. الصحة هنا ليس بمعنى accuracy. It is general vocabulary term. Here it's the validity. And الادعاءات allegations. And sometimes we say الادعاءات الباطلة malicious, false allegations, أو الادعاءات فيها تجني, malicious allegations in the legal cultural context. The other example, ISIS saw death and destruction. زرعت داعش الموت والدمار. ويمكن أن نغير أيضا الزراعة، لأن الزراعة يعني جيدة أن نزرع الشيء. زرع قنابل أو زرع. I don't think this is the right term to use, because الزراعة أحيانا نقول يزرع ما يحصد أو يحصد ما يزرع عفوا. وزراعة قد تكون الشوك أيضا. But it is used in the Arabic culture for something good. So I do prefer to change that. The other example, mouthings, lies and fabrications. ترجمة التصريحات السياسية الغريبة, mouthings. Here this is not really very much successful. Mouthings when you speak just lip service in a way. ليس الغريبة, but here just saying nothing. الأكاذيب والافتراءات we do accept it. Now, with that, these examples, I would like to check with you another term and word, which is resolution. And here I would like to call Safa to display the graph on resolution. Resolution has been studied in one of my papers in a parallel corpus. How resolution is being translated in that corpus into Arabic, and then those target words, how they have been back translated into English, and those back translations into back translation back into Arabic. So I would like to, I'm not going to focus on that, but the target words are displayed: استشراب, استبانة, تسوية, قرار, حل, تسوية, etc. Now, I'm going to move on with another example of Erez crossing. I have been called to interpret a sensitive meeting, confidential meeting of mediation between Israelis and Palestinians. And the mediation was conducted by a European country, a government of a European country. So the mediator was a former ambassador of that state into Jordan. And I had no clue about the subject at the time, and except for the general topic on water resources and so on, they were going to discuss. And the mediator said the following, and now we move on to discuss the problems pertaining to the Erez crossing. I interpreted it, والآن نمر لنتباحث بشأن معبر Erez. And here the Palestinian delegate really stood up and protested against the interpreter, who was myself, stating, هذا ما هو معبر إسرائيلي، هذا معبر بيت حانون، هذا معبر فلسطيني. And I apologized, And later on, after the meeting, he followed me, the guy from Gaza, and he told me, apologies, it was not you who was meant by the protest, dear friend. And I knew that. So here you need to act and use some good offices and understand with experience that you were not the targeted person at that moment, because it was a criticism for the mediator for being biased. Now, I will end with another story. Last week, I was interpreting in a high-level meeting. Yes.
يعني يمكن اختزال ختام لأنه تجاوزنا الوقت المحدد للمدة.
نعم، دقيقة واحدة وأختتم إن شاء الله.
تفضل.
شكرا. I was interpreting in a high-level meeting. It was in the judiciary, a judicial official, and he happened to be from Algeria. And they were discussing some issues with European counterparts. Now, the European delegate stated the following: I don't promise that we will fix the problems overnight and that there will be heaven on earth and spring will be back. The interpreter translated it as follows: لا أعدك بأن الأمور سيتم تسويتها بين عشية وضحاها وبأن الربيع سيحل وتعود العصافير تزقزق من جديد. So this is a sort of a judicious intervention by the interpreter. Now, when he took the floor, the Arab official, the Algerian official, he stated the following: أنا أتفهم ذلك تماما. I really understand that. ولا نحن لا نصبو إلى أن تعود العصافير لتزقزق، فقط نتأكد من أنها بقيت على قيد الحياة. So we certainly do understand that. We would love only to see the birds surviving, and spring will come eventually. So here, this is a very good example of that intervention. And the interpreter has to clarify later on to the delegate that the metaphor of birds, how it is used in the Arabic culture. And this is really was very well received by the European delegate. And I will end with the quote. Last word about interpreting. The last slide, please. Interpreting looks two ways. It opens up a passage and a heart, drawing near what might always remain afar. And thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention, and apologies for the internet issues. And I am really keen and I can take questions in English, Arabic, or French. Thank you very much, and back to you, Dr. بالعايلة. شكرا. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا لك أستاذ، بورك فيك على المداخلة القيمة وهذا العرض المميز، سواء من خلال الصور أو من خلال الفيديوهات التي قدمتها والشروحات بالأمثلة بمختلف اللغات وترجمتها إلى غير ذلك. فأعتقد بأنها يعني لاحظت أنه حتى من خلال يعني الحضور وما علقوا عليها الكثير أعجبتهم المداخلة، وهنالك بعض الأسئلة. ومن بين الملاحظات أجد مثلا actually Mr. Hamuda, I can't get enough of your talk. This is so interesting and what a great experience you have. وغيرها الكثير من المداخلات والتعليقات. كانت مداخلات قيمة. لا أدري إن كان هنالك أسئلة يمكن للحضور أن يطرحوها الآن في قسم المحادثة، وسننقلها إلى الأستاذ حمودة أو إلى سيسيليا التي لا تزال متواجدة معنا، فيمكننا نقلها شفهيا. بارك الله فيكم. بارك الله فيك بروفيسور، أمتعتنا بمداخلتك القيمة. فعلى ما يبدو لست الوحيد الذي استحسن وأعجبته هذه المداخلة. سيسيليا هي متواجدة معنا، يمكنها ربما أن تلتحق بنا. هل لديكم ربما تعليقات؟ Do you have any comments, any additions, any questions? So the panelists are here, except Mr. Nolan. You can discuss or share thoughts.
أستاذ بالعالية، لا أعرف إذا كانت هناك حتى أسئلة بعد هذا اللقاء، فيمكن أن أتواصل مع الحضور الكريم ومن يريد أو من يرغب في طرح هذه الأسئلة حتى بعد هذا المؤتمر لنناقشها سوية. وإذا كانت هناك أسئلة كما قلت فيمكن أن نجيب عنها الآن.
بالفعل. إذا لدي سؤال هنا. Dr. Salahi, don't you think that these judicious interventions clash with the duty of the interpreter to be impartial? There is a fine line between preserving the accuracy, polishing someone's statement.
Can I answer now?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I don't know who asked the question, but thank you very much for this very good question. Anwar. Thank you, dear Anwar. Certainly, I agree with you, but still, these judicious interventions are really not being used almost always or randomly, but still, I think that a competent interpreter has the power and the freedom to see the exchange and to judge, like a judge here and a mediator, to say whether this is appropriate, whether it is appropriate to make that intervention. But sometimes if you don't make that intervention, there might be some clash, there might be some conflict, like the example of the security officer who brought the piece of bread. If you do not intervene and add some cultural element, then there might be a clash between him and the other officers. And here you are a messenger of peace. You are not a messenger of war, certainly. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Can I add one comment, practical comment on how to do this? Because I understand their reticence, especially from conference interpreting training, that we should never meddle with the message. And as diplomatic interpreters, sometimes we have to, as Dr. Hamouda is very well saying. So sometimes what I do, it all depends on the situation, the level of formality, and how much I can interact with my client. But usually, if it is a very high level thing, like the ones that you see on TV, where you have the two heads of state with the interpreters behind, that is the most formal setting, and there's nothing that you can do. Sometimes you can, and you are whispering to your clients here, so you can clarify, you can let them know if it is important and you're nervous about it. Just so you know, I clarify this for cultural reference sake. And that's it. It's also part of having your clients back, which is what we do as diplomatic interpreters. And those cultural references that sometimes are missing, sometimes is when we are interpreting the message. Sometimes it's not even when we are interpreting. And just a very light-hearted anecdote. I was accompanying a minister for international trade of a Latin American country. And it was after his presentation and his lecture, and he was networking. And he was approached by the representatives of the Scottish Beverages Association or something like that. And they were talking about a very classic brand of gin called Beefeater's Gin. in the UK. And they were talking about the beef eaters, Chin. And I could tell the minister was completely lost and he was nodding without knowing what they were talking about. So I approached as if I was going to interpret, but instead I said, if a brand of gin, that's very traditional. So behind his back, he gave me a thumbs up. He said, okay, got it. So you need to assess the situation. There's a constant decision-making. And you need to assess the situation, when to intervene, when not to, when to ask for clarification, when not to. And every single time you can, keep your client up to date with what's happening at the time or afterwards. Or you can agree beforehand as well, which I did with the Argentine delegation when they were coming to discuss the Falklands, which is the Malvinas Islands, the war between the UK and Argentina, and they're still fighting. And one call is called the islands one way, the other one's called the island the other way. And so I had to agree with my client how we wanted to call the islands. So and you do that beforehand. So it all depends.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Cecilia. So there is a question from Mr. Hamisi, a senior interpreter here in Algeria. As you referred to interpreting cultural issues, how do you cope with interpreting idioms, puns, proverbs, jokes, etc., which puts the interpreter often in an awkward situation?
Shall I answer the question?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Would you like me to answer in English or in Arabic? Depends. I don't know.
Like you want. Okay, in English, there is an Arabic interpreter, so no problem.
Excellent. So here, I think the interpreter, when going to a conference, has to get prepared. For example, some of my colleagues and I were interpreting for conferences called الدعوة. It was a conference initiated by the former leader, President Muammar al-Gaddafi, and the people over there, the delegates, were quoting and citing Quran and the Sunnah quite often. So here you get prepared, and we do work in pairs, in the sense that when there is a verse of Quran cited, somebody else would check for it, the translation, and the on-mic interpreter would simply read it. And with regard to now proverbs and other those forms of idiomatic expressions and so on, I think this really adds to the interpreting to make it sound much more professional and good quality performance, and if you have recourse to it. Now, if you don't, just explain what is being said. But if you can, for example, one delegate might say, and now we move on to the best part, the hardcore of everything, to discuss about money and funding. Here, if he were speaking in Arabic, he would have said something like that. والآن نمر لنتباحث بشأن الجوانب المالية وكما تعرفون المال قوام الأعمال. I can add it, even though it is not being said in the original speech. And if you have something very similar, then we can end وختامها مسك مثلا, least but not last, etc. So there are some conventional equivalences at proverb level. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Cecilia, go ahead.
And this also helps perhaps clarify one of the questions from the chat as well regarding translating and interpreting in diplomatic settings. So when we are interpreting, first of all, it's not a black and white situation. Every conversation is like I don't want to say 50 because it's not a cultural reference. Let's say it's 1,000 Shades of Grey. That's diplomacy. So we have so the spectrum of conversation, formality, register, language, variety. There are so many things at play. So we need to read the situation very well. Humor is I would say is a natural way of trying to break the ice, especially in certain cultures. And that is the purpose of it. So if it is tricky, humor is always tricky, but you need to see beyond what the joke is. What's the purpose of the joke? To break the ice. Maybe you can use that instead of having to rely on words. And there are so many experiences and anecdotes about this. I had a Mexican minister who kept making the joke in Spanish. Apparently it's very funny to say, like Jack the Ripper said, let's take it piece by piece. And he kept making the joke saying we're going to go one point at a time. That's what he wanted to say. And he thought it was hilarious, but I wasn't interpreting it. I was saying, let's go little by little. So he asked me, I didn't interpret it once. And then he said, I wanted to interpret my joke. And he said, well, your joke is not going to work because it's not funny. He said, but I want you to do it. Okay. So we made a deal over lunch. I said, I will interpret it. And then you decide whether you want me to continue to interpret it. And what happened was what I knew. That half the table was laughing and half the meeting table was looking at him like saying, are you crazy? What's going on with this guy? And then he said, okay, now I believe you. So you need to read the situation, and that happens. When we are translating Proverbs, we also have to monitor ourselves, because sometimes there are expressions that in my Spanish, my Argentine Spanish, mean one thing, and they exist in other Latin American countries, and they mean another. So when in doubt, go to the standard. What's the worst that can happen? That a joke is lost? If the joke just wants to break the ice, I mean, breaking the ice is just one split second in an entire negotiation. Move on. I mean, you have to learn to let go, okay? Then sometimes it's not easy in your personal lives when you're interpreting. Let go, let go, let go, okay? And also, and this was, again, experience, be very much aware, and you live and learn, and that's how you learn it, about our own preconceptions. So we were interpreting, it was a conference and a meeting related to Judaism. So it was about Jewish culture, and there was this rabbi who was talking, and he was, first of all, using English and Hebrew, which meant that I had to get my Spanish, which is naturally 30% longer, into the English, so I didn't overlap with his Hebrew, because the audience understood Hebrew, but I don't. And then when using certain words, he was saying the sacredness of, he was talking the sacredness of the Torah. And I just said la santidad, which is the holiness. And I immediately checked myself and said, no, that's my upbringing from a Catholic country, but that's not the upbringing of a Jewish culture. So you need to monitor yourself that way. What happens? You correct yourself. And if necessary, you apologize. But take the stress out of, yes, proverbs, humor thing, and try to see what's behind it. Sometimes it's about giving a touch of color, making the discourse richer. Well, we have our voice. If there's a proverb that tries to convey openness and warmth, I can use my voice. I don't have to use just words, because there's a whole lot of me that's providing the interpretation. Otherwise, I just let Google Translate do it, or Siri, and I stay home. Okay? So that's what we mean when we say context. Yeah. All those things are at play. And you could even get somebody saying something and making gestures that actually communicate the opposite. So what will you communicate? The words or the gesture? Or the contradiction?
Exactly.
You see?
And sometimes the gestures are different from one culture to another.
Yes.
A yes could mean a no in some places.
Exactly. And that's the context is I mean, it's way bigger. And you need to read the situation, read the person, read what's going on, and read the meaning. That's what we talk about, meaning, and what's the intention behind it. Okay, I always say, if you had experience interacting with English diplomats and government officials and things, you probably know the word lovely. It's lovely word, but lovely means at least 150 different things. It rarely means lovely.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like
so,
the Arabic word, inshallah.
Exactly.
Inshallah.
And that's why I believe that if you want to be a good diplomatic interpreter, you need to be immersed in the cultures that you're working with.
Totally
It's
agree.
a must. Yeah.
It is.
May I take just 1 minute or less to comment on jokes, translation of jokes?
Yeah, there is just one saying I
please.
spotted quickly.
Yes, please.
I think it was Mr. Shaib who said,
yeah,
take care of the meaning and the words will take care of themselves.
Exactly.
I think it
is a very good
it is
saying.
a perfect saying.
Yeah.
I totally
to the
agree.
situation.
It's
Yes.
the triangle, Danica Seleskiewicz's triangle, when you go and you
Yes.
extract the meaning and things. Yeah.
Exactly. So I have interviewed the president of the European Court of Justice, and he told me that we asked all of the delegates coming to the court not to tell jokes because the speeches are translated into 28 languages and then with a relay and long pivot. So with not half laughing and the other not the other half of the audience not laughing, but you will hear the German speakers laughing now, and then after 30 seconds the French speakers, and then the Romanian, and so on. So this created some chaos. So they have warned all of the delegates not to tell jokes. This is the first thing. The other thing, and I have shared with you, allow me to call you Fauzi, and please call me Hamouda.
Yes, please.
Link. It's a very short, 30 seconds at least, and I subtitled it into English about a call of a delegate official, who is Tunisian official, not to translate certain stuff. So I called it interpreting. So here you need to judge again by the context, especially this is in community interpreting, and in sometimes interpreting in a diplomatic setting. So did you receive the link?
Yes, it is the one you shared here on the chat box, right?
On the chat box, yes, please.
Okay.
So yes.
أنا شنو يوصل مقصودي أنا ما يوصلش المعنى نتاع الكلمة. خاطر احنا زاد نجم مثلا ساعات في أوقات زادة ساعات أنا نبدأ متنرفز. نقول كلمة معناتها نقولها هكاك، نقول كلمة مش غايتي باش المترجم يوصلها. خاطرني أنا تغششت وقلت لك الكلمة هذيك لازم المترجم يفهم نفسيتي أنا ويعرف اللي الكلمة هذيك تقابته ما نحبهاش توصل من غير ما نقول له أنا ما تعودهاش.
Here is another example of the delegates, the participants in the discussion, calling the interpreter not to translate certain things and sometimes to judge the thing from the context. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So
yes, and in that and in those situations which happen, it might sound very harsh, but with a request like that, I would just follow the instructions on the person that's signing my check, because that's my client.
Absolutely.
It's if the client says, I want you to call the islands this way, well, that's what I do with the client. And then probably the next day I'm interpreting for the opposite party. And then I call them the way they want. So it is a collaboration, and you need to talk to your clients, especially before going into a diplomatic setting. Yeah,
exactly.
Definitely.
The issue of loyalty is very problematic. Loyalty to whom? Thank you. Yeah.
And that's why in very high levels you have 2 interpreters.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One for each.
1 second. So we have a question. Let's take the last one. How do you handle situations? The question is for Cecilia from Mr. Shaib. How do you handle situations where some people claiming they are bilingual interfere with you interpreting? And it happens a lot.
Okay. Before I answer that one, Anwar said not illegal context. A legal context is not a diplomatic context, which is the whole premise of what we are discussing today. Court interpreting has other requirements. So the logic that you apply to conference, to court, or to public services, and to diplomatic is different. And regarding bilingual, with a lot of patience, that's all I can say. You will come across so many things. You will come across people in the meeting who believe they can do your job better. I have come across situations where I walk into a room and they have the secretary or somebody, the intern, there just in case. I had people, personal embassy staff, who they think they can do it and then they cannot. So what do? You remain calm. You understand that clients have been burned in the past. Everybody has some sort of horrendous, terrible story of an interpreter that didn't work, didn't know how to do the job. So there's a little bit of disregard for what we do. How you handle it, you take care of your thing. Your poise, your composure, your tone, your confidence is going to communicate to your client everything that you do, the tone that you, the voice that you use, how you sit down. And then I usually describe it as the back against, the backs down, the backs against the back of the chair effect. And when you start interpreting, it only takes about 5 seconds to people realize that they can trust you. And that also is experience. But you need to rely on that. Yeah. And once you have that trust, you're good. But they're going to test you. And if you look at every time you're doing consecutive, and there's a bilingual audience, I mean, if you pay attention, they're sort of mentally ticking that you're saying everything, and they go, they nod their heads because they're checking. It's not on purpose. It's just part of it, part of what happens. People are curious. You just, be patient and kind and confident and do your job tremendously well.
Exactly. So on these wise words, let's finish our session. And I would like to thank you again for your patience, first of all, and for the valuable information you presented and shared with us today. But we are a little bit late, so I'm sorry for those who asked questions on the comment section and the chat. We will have to finish this session right now. So what will happen is we will keep the live on this platform. We will take 10 or 15 minutes of break. And the next session, the plenary one, will start just after 10 minutes or 15 minutes. As for the live streaming on Facebook and YouTube, we will stop it right now. And when the second session starts, we will launch a second part of it. So don't worry, even for those who are looking for a recording, you will have the videos on those social media. So thank you so much. Thank you again, and see you later.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Looking forward to the next session.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.